So there's a couple questions that I want us to ponder when considering voter turnout, why we calculate it, how we use it, and perhaps why we're concerned about it, right? So I want to pose to the class, first of all, why is it important to know or be able to predict what voter turnout is going to be in an election or from election to election? And besides that, why should we care? Because voter turnout determines who wins and who loses in elections sometimes, right? Can impact the victors. This is why, as we discussed earlier in the semester, when it comes to polling and how accurate polling is, we oftentimes have to determine who the likely voters are. You can't necessarily just take a poll of American citizens because they're not all necessarily likely to turn out at the same rate. And it's voters who have their opinions carry the day at the ballot box on election day. Besides just the impact on winning and losing, voter turnout impacts the representativeness of our republic, right? So how representative our government is of the people. This certainly might be an area for concern if the populations that aren't turning out to vote at as high of rates are systemically different than the ones that are turning out to the polls. Our representatives in our democracy might look different, right? Might not have the same policy preferences as the general public at large. I also think there's some sort of broader concerns for democracy if voter turnout is at certain levels. And we can, like, most often we approach this from the perspective that, well, low voter turnout is concerning, right? It could be concerning for a few reasons. It could be concerning because there's little faith in the system, perhaps. Perhaps people don't believe that their vote matters, or that even if their vote matters, that what they vote for is going to be turned into policy outcomes. So there might be low efficacy if there's low voter turnout, and some other negative externalities. Like low voter turnout is often associated with like lower social capital in societies, for instance. So perhaps other, concerns for democracy. But what's happening right now in this country? Are we facing an issue at this current moment of heavily dropping turnout rates in our most recent elections? No, voter turnout is increasing. Okay. We might think of this as a normatively good thing. People are using their privilege, their right to vote. They're getting out there and they're making their opinion heard. But is there anyone who thinks that's maybe concerning a little bit? That we've seen voter turnout on the rise? No, is that for sure a normatively good thing?
I mean, less educated voting. Yes.
Okay, so maybe there are certain voters who don't know as much about the system in terms of civics knowledge or policy knowledge, and maybe their voices are being more well represented than they used to be. Okay. I would pose to you guys that if we're approaching every election like it's the most important election in history, and that it matters, and that if the other side wins, that it's a threat to our democracy, our national identity, perhaps even very high voter turnout could be a concern, especially in a democracy that does not have enforced compulsory voting or fines for voting, right, as we do not have in this country. So there's a couple things there. I think voter turnout rates also reflect the legitimacy of the system. If you have very little voter turnout, that's probably not a system that is, legitimately acting as a democracy. So government legitimacy, certainly. And to see that, majority preferences are carrying the day, that you are seeing majorities being reflected in representativeness and in policy. I also want to note that, yes, we calculate voter turnout at this national level often, and that's how we maybe sometimes look at it from election to election. But it's not necessarily uniform across the United States. In our federal system, turnout varies widely by state. And this has held true for a long time, for decades and even hundreds of years. Why does voter turnout vary widely by state? Why are the residents of the state of Washington, for instance, perhaps more or less likely to turn out than residents from the state of Mississippi?
They have different rules.
Oh, okay. So our states have different election laws that might impact how often citizens turn out to the polls. What kind of election laws?
Like, can felons vote? Do you need an ID to vote?
Okay. Yeah, so the voter eligibility, voter standards such as voter ID laws. What other important election laws are perhaps most predictive of voting? We said that one class of people, last class, is particularly likely to vote in this country.
People who go to church?
Well, yeah, that group is, church attendance is highly predictive of voter turnout, yes. We're thinking too much along the lines of demographic groups, I would say. The people who are most likely to cast a vote in an election are those who are registered to vote, right? And registration laws vary massively by state, right? Some states have EDR, which is election day registration. I think 22 states have election day registration or something similar. In North Dakota, everyone's automatically registered, so it's like 23 states. But that's less than half of our states that have that, right? So there are many citizens who are not registered to vote, and getting registered to vote is a significant hurdle when it comes to voting, right? Those who are not registered do not vote at very high rates. And so, yeah, these laws vary from state to state. What else varies from state to state? What have we seen a lot of election laws changing? In fact, we had 4 of these states previously, but just over the last couple of years, that number has doubled in terms of states that allow this in elections. We can even look at the 2020 election and see how that was unique. Many states expanded this. Yeah, so mail-in voting has become far more prevalent, and I think it's a trend we'll probably see continue in this country. Do we think that voter turnout is higher or lower in mail-in states?
Higher.
It's higher, yeah, of course. And if you look at some of our states that have the highest voter turnout rates, they're states like Washington, in Oregon, in Colorado, in these states that have universal mail-in voting. These states, they often do still give the option to their citizens to have in-person voting, but their elections are considered to be conducted on a mail-in basis. Like every citizen receives that mail-in absentee ballot to their address. So we've seen 4 of those states previously in the early 2000s. That number has doubled. It used to be the case that in about 1996, only near 10 or 11% of citizens voted in these non-traditional means, which means not in person on election day. But in 2020, and that 2020 may have been somewhat artificially high because of COVID, of course, but this trend has been steadily upwards ever since. And in 2020, it was about 70% of voters that voted that way.
What year did you say it was at 11%?
That was about 1996. That would have been Bill Clinton's election. Yes.
To kind of get like a sense of how 2020 impacted it versus that, do you know how 2022 looked during the midterms for mail-in?
Yes, so let's try to stick with presidential terms and years, because remember we've talked about that sawtooth graph of voter turnout, right? What is the sawtooth graph of voter turnout, for those of us who might not remember?
The highs are in general elections, the lows are in midterms.
Yeah, we tend to see higher turnout in presidential election years, right? Because people often think of the top of the ticket when they're making this decision about whether or not to cast a vote. So we do see a considerable drop in midterm election years, although it does seem that even in midterm election years, we're seeing higher turnout rates recently in 2020 and even in 2018 for particular classes of voters. Yes. Okay. But yes, that trend has been rising. And even if you look at 2016, the proportion of mail-in ballots was higher than in the past, even if voter turnout across the board was a little lower in 2016, actually. Okay. What else about states leads to them having varying voter turnout rates? Why don't our states turn out at the same rates?
They have different costs of voting. How close is the polling place?
Okay, so maybe it's more difficult and treacherous to get to a polling center 20 miles away in Wyoming than it is in New York City, perhaps, right? So that could be the case. Different conditions. Yeah, that's true.
Electoral college.
Okay, what do you mean by the Electoral College?
It seems as if, the electoral college. So the smaller states, no matter what population, get 3 votes. The bigger states are based on population, but this doesn't actually reflect.
So what does that mean for those states that do have 3 votes?
They have a higher say. Each person has a
Yeah.
much greater say than each person in, say, let's
They have disproportionate
New York.
electoral power
Yes.
to the amount of votes cast in their state. Yes, and that is true. And I would say that the states have different electoral conditions, right? And that's one of them. The Electoral College influences this. What else about the Electoral College influences electoral conditions in states? Swing state voters tend to turn out at higher rates because, and we can even go back to our equation of voter turnout that we talked about last class, right? Turnout is partially dependent on the perceived benefit that your candidate gets from winning the election over the other candidate times the probability that you think your vote matters, basically. The probability of your vote swinging the election, we could say, or at least the perception of it. So that's why swing states tend to turn out at higher rates. It does tend to be the case that our states have different traditions and culture, and so we do see that in some of these places it tends to be northern states and sometimes less populated northern states that have this turnout of going to the polls at the highest rates. States like Minnesota are uniquely pretty much always at the forefront of turnout rates in this country. But the southern region of this country has traditionally turned out to vote at lower rates for decades. And in fact, Oklahoma is one of these states as well. Oklahoma is a state that traditionally does not turn out at a high rate relative to the rest of the country. We know that our states have very different demographics, right, across the country, across a number of different criteria. And one of these important demographic determinants of voter turnout is educational attainment.
But even just the level of.
You mean even just
Even
quality
just
of K through 12?
Yeah, what is
Yeah.
the quality?
Yeah, because
and do they
Oklahoma
turn out?
does have one of the
I think
worst.
we just made the second worst.
In
Just
in
that.
terms of testing outcomes, learning outcomes?
Yeah, testing outcomes.
Yeah, so that could be the case. I mean, remember that some of these important things that are socialized, perhaps at a familial level or in public schools, are highly associated with voter turnout. What I mean by that is sense of civic identity, efficacy, belief in legitimacy of the system and your vote mattering, and those items are likely correlated with maybe not type of education system, but maybe educational outcomes, particularly when it comes to civics knowledge, for instance. So that could be the case. I need the overlay map of AP Gov scores in order to. But so a lot of these demographics vary from state to state, right? Particularly things like familial income level, how we measure socioeconomic status traditionally when we're running voter turnout regression equations, basically.
I wonder if minimum wage has to do with voter turnout. I wonder if that has a connection.
I'm curious about that. Yes, I wonder. And then educational attainment, of course, very predictive of voter turnout, increasingly so. But I do want you guys to remember this. If you ask people in a survey if they turned out to vote, do you tend to get higher rates of voter turnout or lower rates of voter turnout than reality? Higher. Okay, why higher?
It looks good to vote.
Exactly.
So people have this perception that voting is a normatively good thing, a net good for society that they perhaps ought to be doing, and so they respond that way in a survey, even if it isn't true. Perhaps they err that way. So it turns out that individuals who are higher in educational attainment, who have had more years of schooling, exhibit more social desirability bias on that question. Perhaps they've been socialized to believe that that voting is a social good and thus respond that way. So if you ask people in surveys, we get even higher differences in voter turnout between the highly educated and the less highly educated. Another thing I want to touch on is gender. Traditionally, male citizens turned out to vote at higher rates than female citizens throughout much of the 20th century. That trend has flipped around the year 2000, and females have voted at slightly higher rates ever since. Considering this gender gap in voter turnout, considering educational attainment, and considering socioeconomic status and how those demographic factors relate to vote choice, what do these trends mean for our election outcomes going forward? Because we've already talked about how each of these things are related to partisanship and are related to choosing candidates in elections. So what do these turnout trends then signal for us? Yeah?
It could mean higher turnout for Democrats, because women and
It could. So traditionally in this country for the last several decades, Republicans have had a voter turnout advantage, right? It wasn't necessarily that they had more partisans in the national population, but their partisans tended to turn out to vote at higher rates.
Is that in part because they went to church?
I think yeah, certainly. I think the religious aspect, particularly with evangelical Christians who turn out at very high rates, is a big part of that. Church attendance is down across the board over the last decade or so in those groups, but church attendance remains predictive of voter turnout, though. And also, once again, it depends on how you measure religiosity, because importantly, it's church attendance that's tied to voter turnout. It's not necessarily belief in God. It's not necessarily belief in biblical inerrancy that are as closely tied with those things. Okay, so with all these trends, oh yeah, Casey, go ahead.
I was just also going to add to election outcomes, and I guess maybe just the election process and campaigning. Maybe it means that women issues will be discussed more, and maybe different parties will do issue ownership over like women's rights or like health care for families.
Okay.
IVF.
So,
Yeah.
so issues.
Daycare, maybe.
Yes.
So touching back to the previous point, so the Republican advantage in voter turnout is declining, we said, potentially. Now, that doesn't mean that Republicans are doomed in elections necessarily. What that means is that in lower turnout elections, generally, Republicans used to have an advantage, right? In higher turnout elections, Democratic candidates tended to have an advantage. We might be seeing that flip now, going forward in recent years, going forward, where, which may seem odd to us, but that I project that might be the case going forward. Okay, now we might see different issues at the forefront. Oftentimes there's this sort of perspective that, because of the gap in age in voter turnout, because younger people don't turn out to vote at as high of rates as older individuals, that has been reflected in policy in this country, that more and more dollars are spent towards programs that disproportionately benefit older Americans, right? This is a line of thinking that is commonly stated in even intro-level American government classes, right? So who votes definitely has an impact on the issues that are talked about in campaigns and potentially even policy outcomes of elections.
Well, and
Certainly.
doesn't even women being involved in this increase how much we focus on health? Looking broadly.
It could be, and I think if you ask in terms of those issue ownership
Especially
questions
child
that we've looked at from Pew Research Center, women do tend to rank healthcare as a higher issue of importance than men do. And healthcare, in terms of partisan issue ownership, has been one that Democrats do tend to have a public opinion advantage on. Slight, but they do. So yes, I think it certainly reflects the issues that we talk about, specifically the issues that certain candidates talk about when they believe that it advantages them. Right. And I think we kind of hopped ahead and got to age a little quicker than I expected. But age gets a lot of attention for voter turnout for some of the reasons I just listed. Older voters tend to turn out at those highest rates, and younger voters in this 18 to 34 category, as we usually measure them, tend to turn out at the lowest rates of any group of people. Well, why do we think that is? I mean, we're all in this category, right? Or most of us in here. Why? Casey?
People don't have time. They have jobs, families to take care of.
Okay, so maybe higher time constraints. That could be. Maybe not.
Yeah, I was more so thinking kind of the opposite. Like, maybe it doesn't, like, they don't feel like it's as consequential. Like, in the sense that, like, older people that have, like, actual careers, maybe, and things like that, like, that they are looking more into the policies that affect those jobs and their families and things like that.
Okay, so maybe in terms of now we know people tend to vote more with sociotropic economic trends than with their own wallets, but perhaps certain types of economic policy are more relevant to individuals who are already in the workforce or have families, we say, and maybe that's the reason they turn out at higher rates. Going back to the time constraints, I would say that younger people are much more likely to be in college or the military. So those are time constraints. It's not necessarily the same as career time constraints, and there's a lot of people in this category.
Also money constraints almost. People who are older have a more established life, hopefully savings, so it's less.
Yeah, so financial cost, and we know that cost reduce the likelihood of turning out to vote. And if it is costlier to vote, if younger individuals are perhaps less likely to have a motor vehicle to get to the polls, then yeah, we could see that reflected in voter turnout rates. Going back to college and the military, what do individuals who are commonly in college or the military do after they graduate high school? They move at much higher rates than other Americans. So they travel and they move and they're across the country. They're not necessarily in one place. And what happens when we move, especially if we move outside of our original county and district and outside of our original state? What happens?
New offices to vote for.
Yeah, new offices to vote for, but even more important than that. Yes. Whether or not you're registered to vote changes, right? And registration is this barrier to voter turnout, right? A lot of democracies across the world do have automatic voter registration. And as I said, it's determined at a state level here, but only North Dakota of all the states have it. So in most places, you have to get re-registered to vote. And I had my driver's license changed recently, right? A lot, when you go to these new destinations, that becomes a task, something that individuals need to do. So these individuals travel, they move at higher rates than Americans, and even in general, I think 10% of Americans move in between. I don't know if that's in between elections or annually. I'll have to check that for you guys. Did we have anything else on why younger Americans vote at lower rates? Yeah?
They might not see candidates that are like themselves, or they might
That could be. Yeah, we have older candidates in this country. Why do we have older candidates? And we've had increasingly older candidates, I would say. That's not the question I'm asking. But why do we have candidates that aren't in this category necessarily as frequently for Congress, for the Senate, or for the presidency?
Because older people vote more.
Well, yeah, in terms of who's winning primaries, that's one reason. Perhaps older people are voting for those candidates. But structurally, there's a more
No,
basic
as a president,
reason.
You can only be a certain age.
You have to be 35. You can't even be in that category and run for president, right? Now, it's obviously different for the Senate and for the House, right? But still, there are these age floors that are limiting people. So yeah, in terms of descriptive representation, that group can't be voting for someone for president who fits them. Yeah, so that's the case. But I do want you guys to know that this age gap in voter turnout is decreasing noticeably, especially we're talking recently, we're talking just the last decade, since the 2014 midterm. We've seen that this 18 to 34 category of voters is getting closer to turning out at the same rates as older voters. Why do we think that is?
A lot of the people in the categories of 18 to 34 couldn't vote. So,
Oh.
like now it's like
What do you mean by that? Who couldn't vote in the 18 to 34 age categories previously?
anyone in here.
Yeah, like if we're 18, 25 now, we couldn't vote a couple elections ago.
Yeah. So yes, but also keep in mind structurally that suffrage was extended to 18-year-olds too, by the way. So we've had several decades of 18-year-olds and being able to vote in this country. So that was extended downwards. And remember, we did say there does tend to be this lagging effect after suffrage is granted to groups in this country, and we'll get to race in a second. But for many years, after the right to vote is given, we saw African Americans and female voters turn out at lower rates, and then there's this catch-up effect later on.
Is the degree gap related to that gap decreasing?
Oh, is this an impact of educational attainment being higher for this group and increasing? I would say probably yes.
Okay.
I think educational attainment is playing a role in this. Perhaps states like Oklahoma State have a required civics class for every student who comes through the university. We've also seen some different federal laws in place for voting. In 2002, the motor voter law was passed, where individuals are going to the DMV and registration materials are being made available to them. So we have seen some legislative changes that have impacted voter turnout, particularly for younger Americans who are less likely to be registered than other groups of individuals. So I guess talking about that racial category, this racial predictor of voter turnout, particularly when it comes to African Americans, their rates of voter turnout rose sharply in the 1950s and 1960s, perhaps unsurprisingly with the civil rights movement at the time, right? And being able to use this form of political voice actively, and with the decline in Jim Crow laws in that era and going forward. And we've seen a rise in African American voter turnout rates ever since, and particularly a strong rise ever since 2000, where it was actually the case that African American voters have turned out at higher rates than white voters in some certain elections, especially in the President Obama elections of 2008 and 2012. They turned out at higher rates. And now in the most recent election, it was pretty close. It was pretty dead even in terms of voter turnout rates. When it comes to Latino and Latina voters, this group actually tends to turn out at lower rates than the other racial categories. Now, we have seen some movement on this in the Voting Rights Act bill that was passed in 1975, perhaps attempted to alleviate some of these concerns by instituting certain language availability requirements for voter materials, both registration and ballot access materials. For instance, for districts that had more than 5% of a population that speaks a language predominantly that is not English. We've seen some of those materials been made available. Yeah.
Did that only include people who are eligible to vote in that?
Great question. Okay,
There's a lot of-
so last class we talked about the difference between the voting age population and the voter eligible population, right? And these are important to know because they go into the denominator of how we calculate voter turnout, right? Where you have the number of individuals who voted over these things, right? So which group is larger? The voting age population or the voting eligible population? The voting age population is larger. Why?
Because that's not including like the people who are there, like hard, I mean, my bad.
There are people in this group
I meant
who...
is including the hard and the others. That's what I meant to say.
Yes.
My bad.
No, I know exactly what you said. Yeah. So,
It's felons.
yeah, there are individuals in this group who do not have the right to vote, right? So, for instance, felons in not all states, but in many of our states, are not allowed to vote. Yes, and non-citizens are included in the voted age population. Right, so they're in the voting age population, but they are not able to vote. But this gap in Latino and Latina turnout exists for both. It does exist for the voting eligible population too, for citizens who are registered to vote. But yes, then of course that's based on the assumption that perhaps of immigrants who are ineligible to vote, that a higher proportion of them are Hispanic. But yes, I would say that gap exists for both. We do need to take this into account because the voting age population is very commonly used when voter turnout calculations are made. So you want to pay attention to that to see what the denominator was when we're calculating voter turnout. Looking at the voter turnout equation that we know, I'll state it again one more time for the class, that this is a rational theory of voter turnout, right, that was put forth by some political scientists and amended in the 1980s. But turnout is basically essentially a function of the perceived benefit that you get from your preferred candidate winning the election over the other candidate, times the probability that casting your vote is going to make a difference in this election, minus the costs of voting, which we'll talk about in a second, plus this, and this is the recent addition, or recent, I mean, a few decades ago, but relatively recent, plus this D term, which is initially believed to be this, a civic sense of duty that someone gets from voting, but it has, gone on to include these other social and psychological benefits, that we gain from voting, right? Perhaps our neighbors will be impressed with us if we vote, right? But what goes into those costs, and what are some of the impediments that most U.S. citizens commonly face when it comes to voting? Yeah?
A big one is like having to work on election day or like.
Election day is not a national holiday in this country, right? It's on a Tuesday, right? So if someone is planning on voting in person, they may have to take off work. They may have to forego their lunch period in order to go to the polls and vote, right? So day of the week is certainly a structural impediment to voting.
And are we just talking
what else?
about non-mail-in? We're talking about straight up in-person voting for these costs?
We can be talking about multiple forms of voting. The next one that I was thinking of is in regards to all different types of voting, besides in North Dakota. Registration,
register,
right?
yeah.
Individuals have to spend time, learn how to get registered to vote. That's a cost, that's a burden.
And make sure it's always up to date.
And then make
Yeah.
sure it's up to date, yeah.
Yeah.
And we know, some states clean voter rolls if citizens haven't voted for several elections. So like checking, making sure you remain registered.
Or with the right party you wanna be, or.
That's true.
Especially if we're calculating turnout
Especially for
in,
close primaries.
if we're calculating turnout in primary elections, yes, making sure you're a registered Republican or a registered Democrat, especially in a closed primary system where that your eligibility of voting in that race depends on your registration. I'd say other impediments to voting. We have jobs on here. We have school. Yeah, actual financial costs. So here we'll throw in like job, school, child care.
Yeah, that's very true.
You know, in some recent years, we've seen like lines at voting polls. So time is a resource.
Yeah.
We've talked about how voter turnout can actually depend on weather in different places. If you get rain, if you get wind in certain places, so actual weather can impact costs from election to election. And I'd say we've already talked about this in class, but the often studied by political scientists, one of these elements is voter ID laws, which vary from state to state. Always a hot topic of discussion. We do have voter turnout or some form of voter ID laws in most states in this country. But there have been many studies on voter ID laws, and the results, I would say, are mostly mixed and minimal in terms of the ones that do find effects find very small effect sizes. And we know a couple of things about voter ID laws. Certainly know that they have broad support publicly, but know that they do sometimes break down along partisan lines, where they have the support of, in terms of Republican support, they're at about 90% or even higher. But in terms of Democratic support, it's more of a coin flip. But if you take the public at large, they're popular. Know that voter fraud in elections has not been found at scales necessary to swing election outcomes. So if it's used to alleviate that concern, it's debatable over whether they are necessary, right? But also know that there may be some social benefits of voter ID laws in terms of belief in safety of election outcomes. And then finally, we can finish with the psychology of voter turnout. So I want to let you guys know that non-voters tend to have the lowest trust in government, of course, which makes sense. Also lower levels of political self-efficacy. And then also interesting, I know we've talked about genetics in this class before in relation to partisanship and ideology. And there is evidence that there is both a socialized effect on voting from familial learning, but also a genetic component. And once again, from these twin studies, from the biopolitics literature that we've talked about. So it does appear that there are social and genetic influences on voter turnout rates. And this could be a function of that, it's more politically interested and more politically knowledgeable individuals that turn out to vote. So that could be directly related to that. And we've also discussed one last time social pressure. And this is a famous study by Gerber, Green, and Larimer that if you inform individuals, neighbors, and if you tell them in a mailer that their neighbors can see whether or not they voted, they are far more likely to turn out to vote. In fact, that was on a quiz that we had. The turnout rates are far higher than most other mailers are predicted. But individuals can be prompted, they can be primed to vote, and this result was also backed up in a social media study recently too, that if you tell people on social media that perhaps their friends can see if they voted or not. I absolutely will. Awesome. But yeah, so that's some of the psychology of voter turnout. I think we're at time. Thank you all very much for coming today. I appreciate it.